Hey guys, good evening. Welcome to another evening of medieval stories that will make you thankful you live in the 21st century. Before we start, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Tell us in the comments where you're listening to this from now. Have you taken the opportunity to turn off the lights, grab your tea or hot chocolate, and snuggle under the covers? Good, because tonight is going to be electrifying. Before you get too comfortable, know this. In 1297, a thunderstorm was not just a spectacle of nature to be admired from the window. It was a harbinger of death, destruction, and terror that made even the bravest of men tremble with fear and fall to their knees in prayer. While today you're angry because the internet has gone down, or because you can't order delivery, our medieval ancestors faced an apocalyptic scenario without any real protection. Let's put it into context. We're talking about the end of the 13th century, when Europe was constantly changing. Philip IV ruled France, Edward I commanded England, and Pope Boniface VIII had just assumed the papal throne. But none of that mattered when the skies darkened and the first lightning bolts cut across the horizon. Everything Netflix and the movies have shown you about medieval storms is a romanticized version where the main characters are huddled in comfortable castles, perhaps with a fire burning, while they talk about conspiracies and forbidden loves. The reality? Brutal, relentless, and absolutely terrifying. No weather forecast, no lightning rods, no suitable buildings, and, worst of all, a population completely dominated by superstitious fear. A storm wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was the manifestation of divine wrath, a sign that something terrible was coming, or worse, a perfect opportunity for demons and witches to have their party. Now close your eyes. You are in 1297. The first drops begin to fall, heavy as stones, while the once blue sky turns into an oppressive black mass. The wind picks up, howling through the gaps in the wooden walls of your humble home. And then, the first clap of thunder, a rumble so intense that it seems to tear the very fabric of the sky. You're a simple peasant. Your house, contrary to what many people think, is not made of stone. That luxury is for nobles and clerics. Your dwelling is a precarious wooden structure covered in straw and mud. The roof, also made of straw, is far from watertight. In a matter of minutes, water begins to seep through, forming puddles on the dirt floor. But that's the least of their problems. Your house is the worst possible place during a thunderstorm in 1297. Why? Firstly, the wooden structure is highly flammable. A single bolt of lightning strikes your house, and everything goes up in flames in seconds. There is no fire department. There is no emergency number. If the fire starts, your only hope is for the rain to be strong enough to put it out before it consumes everything, including you and your family. The thatched roof not only lets water in, but also becomes a deadly hazard when soaked. The additional weight can cause the whole structure to collapse on your head while you sleep. And don't think that running outside is a better option. Death by lightning was extremely common in those days. You look around in despair. Your family is terrified. The children are crying, cowering in the driest corner of the house, if there is one. Your wife tries to light a candle to illuminate the sudden darkness, but the gusts of wind coming through the cracks make it almost impossible. And when she finally succeeds, you pray that no sparks will hit the dry straw left on the ceiling. And there's more. The smell. Oh, the smell. During a medieval storm, the smoke from the fireplace coming back into the house because the wind has changed direction. The smell of damp, mold, and wet earth. The stench of the animals that, if you're lucky enough to own some, are housed with you in the same structure. Pigs, chickens, maybe a cow, all as terrified as humans, defecating out of fear. Literally, the sounds are another level of terror. Among the deafening thunder, you hear the creaking of the wood that supports your house, as if it could break at any moment. The whistling of the wind finding every crevice of your precarious dwelling sounds like the wailing of lost souls. And the worst, the local church bell ringing frantically, not to mark the hours, but as a desperate attempt to ward off divine fury. Speaking of churches, you might think, why not run there? Churches are made of stone. They must be safer. Ah, my 21st century friend, that's precisely the worst place to be during a storm in 1297. Churches were the tallest structures in towns and cities, with their stone towers and steeples reaching to the heavens, literally inviting lightning to strike. And that frantically ringing bell? The poor sod assigned to ring it during storms was often the first victim, electrocuted while pulling the metal strings. Medieval churches, with their impressive Gothic structures, were like natural lightning rods, only without the stop part. They attracted the lightning, but had no way of dispersing the energy. Reports from the time describe scenes of horror. Worshippers gathered in prayer inside the churches during storms, only to be struck by lightning that pierced the steeple and exploded the stained glass windows, throwing colorful shards like deadly projectiles over the congregation. That's when the impact itself didn't bring down parts of the ceiling or walls on the faithful. Let me tell you a story that circulated in medieval Europe in a small village near Lyon, France, in 1285, just 12 years before our scenario. A violent storm struck during Sunday Mass. The priest, determined not to interrupt the divine service, continued with the prayers while the thunder shook the foundations of the church. He is reported to have said, "Not even the devil will stop us from worshiping God." Minutes later, a bolt of lightning struck the steeple, ran through the bell rope, and blew up the altar where the priest was standing. Survivors reported that the priest's body was thrown against the wall with such force that his bones audibly broke. No one interpreted this as a simple accident. For them, either God was punishing the priest's arrogance, or the devil had really won the battle. Any scientific explanation was out of the question. Now imagine you're in that church. Imagine the terror, not just physical, but spiritual. Imagine seeing a representative of God being struck down before your eyes while performing sacred rites. How would that shake your faith? How would it change your perception of storms? And let's be honest, if you were in a city, the situation wouldn't be much better. The narrow streets would quickly turn into rivers of mud, excrement, and garbage, carrying diseases that would kill more slowly than lightning, but just as efficiently. The manholes, they didn't exist as we know them today. The water simply flowed to the lowest point in the city, usually creating a pestilential lake that would take days to dry up. The medieval city during a storm was a death trap for many reasons that are rarely portrayed in movies. Let's dive deeper into this apocalyptic urban scenario. Medieval cities, especially the larger ones like Paris, London, or Florence, were densely populated agglomerations surrounded by walls. These walls, designed to protect against human invaders, became death traps during floods, preventing the natural flow of water. The streets weren't paved like they are today. They were dirt in the poorer towns, or uneven cobblestones in the richer ones. None of them had an efficient drainage system. Rainwater mixed with human and animal waste was simply dumped on the streets. The concept of basic sanitation was practically non-existent. The result? A toxic broth that rose rapidly with the rain, invading the houses through the first floors. In Paris, for example, the River Seine often overflowed during severe storms, flooding entire neighborhoods. The poorest residents, who lived in basements or on the first floor of precarious buildings, were the first to suffer. Many drowned in their sleep when the waters suddenly rose at dawn. Others succumbed days later, victims of diseases contracted when they came into contact with the contaminated water. What if you lived in the region we know today as the Netherlands? Never mind. Large parts of these lands were below sea level, protected by primitive dikes that often gave way during severe storms. Whole villages disappeared overnight, swallowed up by the sea. In the Great Storm of St. Marcellus in 1362, a few years later than our scenario, but illustrative nonetheless, it is estimated that between 25,000 and 40,000 people drowned when dikes broke on the North Sea coast. Villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. Now, let's talk about urban infrastructure, or the lack of it. Medieval bridges, even stone ones, were not designed to withstand floods. Many were narrow, with numerous close pillars that easily became makeshift dams when branches and debris accumulated against them. The pressure built up until, suddenly, the entire bridge gave way. If you were crossing at the wrong moment, your chances of survival were practically zero. Have you ever heard of Old London Bridge? The one that fell down in the children's song, London Bridge is Falling Down. It's not just a song, it's a reflection of medieval reality. The original bridge has been rebuilt several times after collapses caused by storms and floods. And the scariest thing? There were houses and stores built on that bridge. Imagine being asleep in your house when suddenly the whole structure starts to shake, and within seconds you're falling into the turbulent waters of the Thames, along with your family and all your belongings. Urban markets also became disaster zones during storms. The stalls, made of wood and cloth, flew like leaves in the wind, becoming deadly projectiles. Products, grains, fabrics, ceramics were destroyed in minutes, bringing merchants to instant ruin. In an economy without insurance or compensation, a single storm could mean the difference between a comfortable life and begging. If you were a peasant out in the open, working in the fields when the storm suddenly hit, your chances were even worse. Without shelter, holding metal tools like scythes or hoes, you were practically a human lightning rod. Many died this way, struck down while desperately trying to save a little of the harvest that would determine whether or not they would go hungry in the coming months. Medieval fields. Oh, those were particularly treacherous during storms. Let's imagine you're a peasant working in 1297. The sky is clear when you leave home at dawn, carrying your scythe and some provisions for the day. There's no weather forecast, no app to check if it's going to rain. You're miles away from any shelter, absorbed in the work of harvesting when the first clouds begin to form on the horizon. In the Middle Ages, farm work couldn't wait. Every day of harvest lost could mean starvation in the winter months. So, even though you could see the clouds approaching, you kept working, hoping to finish before the rain came. Fatal mistake. Medieval storms could form and advance surprisingly quickly, especially in summer. No warnings, no alarms, no cell phones to call for help. When the first thunder sounds, you realize that you won't be able to get home or to any nearby shelter in time. The options are limited and all bad. Continue out into the open, hide under a tree, or run to the nearest barn. Hiding under a tree. A bad idea, but many peasants did it out of sheer desperation. Trees, especially tall ones like oaks, attracted lightning with alarming frequency. Medieval records are full of accounts of people struck while sheltering under trees during storms. A chronicle from a monastery near Tours in France describes how 5 peasants were found dead under an oak tree after a storm, their bodies black as coal and twisted into positions that no living man could assume. The monks interpreted it as divine punishment for working close to Sunday, a more comforting explanation than admitting the cruel randomness of nature. The barn, perhaps? Another deadly danger. Medieval barns were wooden buildings, often the highest point on a farm after the trees. Filled with dry hay and straw, they became instant incinerators when struck by lightning. Worse still, wet or damp hay generated heat through fermentation and could spontaneously combust. Many barns caught fire during storms, even if they weren't struck directly by lightning. All it took was for moisture to penetrate the incorrectly stored hay. There are records of entire farms being consumed by fires that started in barns during storms. A small spark, a bit of dry hay, and the strong wind would spread the flames to surrounding stables, houses, and fields. Entire rural communities could disappear in a matter of hours. What if you were plowing the field when the storm started? The medieval plow, often with metal parts, connected to oxen or horses, became a perfect conductor for lightning. The animals, frightened by the thunder, would often panic, dragging the farmer for meters or even kilometers before he could get loose. Many were killed not by lightning, but by the fear-crazed draft animals themselves. Think also about clothing. A rain-soaked peasant, wearing woolen clothes that weighed several kilos when wet, had his mobility severely compromised. Trying to run for shelter in these conditions was almost impossible. Many ended up falling, unable to get up again, and died of hypothermia, even in summer storms. Castles, which look so safe in the movies, also had their dangers. Yes, their thick stone walls offered protection from rain and wind. But the high towers, like church steeples, attracted lightning. What's more, moisture easily penetrated the walls, making the interior cold and conducive to the spread of respiratory diseases. Many nobles died not from the lightning itself, but from the pneumonia they contracted during these stormy periods. Let's take a deeper look at these apparently safe castles during storms in 1297. First, we need to debunk the idea that castles were comfortable places. Most were cold, damp, and poorly lit even on the best of days. During storms, they became even darker and more uncomfortable. The towers and battlements, distinctive elements of medieval castles, were real death traps during lightning storms. Guards doing rounds in these exposed areas were easy targets for lightning. Chronicles of the time tell of soldiers struck down while doing their duty, their bodies often thrown from the battlements into the inner courtyard, creating scenes of horror for those who witnessed it. The observation towers, always the highest point in the castle, were particularly dangerous, built specifically to have maximum visibility of the surrounding area. They became perfect conductors during electrical storms. In 1284, for example, the main tower of Coucy Castle in France was struck by lightning so powerful that it cracked the structure from top to bottom. 3 guards died instantly, and the tower had to be completely rebuilt. Inside the castle, other dangers awaited. The heating system, when it existed, consisted mainly of open fireplaces. Medieval chimneys were rudimentary, often no more than openings in the ceiling or wall. During storms with strong winds, the smoke was often pushed back into the rooms, causing suffocation. There are reports of nobles and servants who suffocated to death in their chambers during particularly violent storms, when all the windows and doors were closed to keep the rain out, without realizing that they were trapping the smoke inside. The structure of the castles also presented unique vulnerabilities during storms. Many were built over centuries, with additions and modifications that were not always perfectly integrated. This created structural weak points that could give way during severe storms. In 1290, part of the north wall of Warwick Castle in England collapsed during a storm, killing 3 people who were sheltering next to it. The moats, designed to hinder enemy attacks, became deadly dangers during heavy rains. Often connected to nearby rivers, they could quickly overflow, flooding the lower levels of the castle, including dungeons and food storerooms. In some cases, the sudden rise in water levels could compromise the very foundations of the castle, causing landslides and partial collapses. And do you know what's worse than being in a castle during a storm? Being in the dungeons of one. Underground, without proper ventilation, these torture chambers became death traps. When the waters invaded, chained prisoners had no chance of escaping drowning. When the water levels rose rapidly, it was a slow and agonizing death. In complete darkness, listening to the water rise inexorably. Medieval dungeons were already places of horror on normal days, but during storms they turned into nightmare scenarios worthy of horror movies, except that it was all real, usually located in the lower levels of castles, often below ground level. They were the first places to flood when the rains intensified. A record from the 13th century, found in a monastery near a castle in the south of France, describes the fate of prisoners during a particularly severe storm. The water rose in the lower cells to the height of a man. The cries of the prisoners could be heard throughout the castle, but no one dared go down to free them, fearing being swept away. When the storm passed, 3 days later, they found only swollen and disfigured bodies. The chaplain refused to give them a Christian burial, claiming that their deaths by drowning were a sign that they had made a pact with the devil, who had come for them through the waters. Prisoners who survived the floods often succumbed to illness in the following weeks. The stagnant water in the dungeons, mixed with excrement and food scraps, created a perfect environment for the proliferation of disease carrying rats and insects. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections slowly killed those whom immediate drowning had spared. In some castles, such as Chillon in Switzerland, built over Lake Geneva, the dungeons were intentionally positioned so that they could be flooded when the lake level rose, an additional form of torture for the prisoners, who lived in constant terror at every dark cloud on the horizon. And then there are the mills. Wow, the mills, tall structures, usually located on hills to better capture the wind, made of wood, and often located near bodies of water. A perfect lightning rod, with the bonus of flammable material and the risk of flooding. Millers were known for their courage, or foolishness, in operating these structures. During storms, many died trying to save not their own lives, but the precious flour that would feed the community. Mills occupied a central position in medieval economic life. Without them, there was no flour. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, hunger was inevitable. This explains why millers often risked their lives during storms to protect both the structure and its precious contents. A typical medieval windmill was a wooden construction on a stone base with huge cloth or wooden sails that caught the wind. During storms, these sails had to be retracted quickly to prevent the strong wind from destroying the mechanism or causing the mill to spin out of control. Imagine the scene: a miller climbing up the outer structure of the mill, dozens of meters high, amid howling winds and torrential rain, trying to tie down or dismantle the sails before disaster struck. Many millers were thrown to their deaths when a particularly strong gust ripped them from the structure. Others were crushed when their own sails, knocked out of control by the force of the wind, hit them like giant guillotines. An account from 1289 describes how a mill near Canterbury, England, spun so fast during a storm that its sails blew out, decapitating the miller, who was trying to control them, and killing 2 horses grazing almost 100 meters away. Watermills weren't much better off. Built on or near rivers, they were extremely vulnerable to flooding. A suddenly overflowing river could flood the mill's internal mechanism, damaging irreplaceable wooden gears, or worse, completely changing its course and leaving the mill unusable. During storms, millers often spent the night trying to build makeshift barriers to divert the flow of water or protect essential machinery. In 1297, flour was often stored in the mill itself until it could be distributed. A storm that damaged the mill and its stock meant not only the loss of the structure, but potentially condemned an entire community to starvation in the following months. It's no wonder that some feudal lords considered the destruction of mills during wars to be a particularly cruel tactic, the medieval equivalent of bombing power stations in modern conflicts. One aspect that is often overlooked is the millers' social status. Because they controlled the production of an essential commodity, they were important figures in the communities, but also often resented for charging a share of the production as payment for the use of the mill. usually belonging to the feudal lord. When a mill was destroyed by a storm, it was not uncommon for rumors to emerge that the miller had been punished by gods or saints for his supposed greed. Natural tragedy quickly became divine justice in the medieval mindset. Let's talk about monasteries, places of peace and contemplation, not during a storm in 1297. Often built in isolated locations, monasteries could offer relatively safe stone structures, but their isolation meant that if something went wrong, a fire caused by lightning, for example, there was no help on the way. The monks relied solely on prayers and buckets of water to fight the flames. Medieval monasteries are often imagined as oases of tranquility and security, but during violent storms, their vulnerabilities were exposed in terrifying ways. Many were built in remote locations, mountains, isolated valleys, islands, chosen precisely for their remoteness from the secular world. This very characteristic, however, made them particularly vulnerable when nature raged. Let's take the famous Mont Saint-Michel in France as an example. Built on a rocky outcrop that becomes an island during high tide, it was, and still is, an architectural marvel. But during storms, when high tide and strong winds coincided, gigantic waves crashed against its walls with enough force to shake its foundations. Monks reported nights of absolute terror, clinging to their beds as the entire building seemed to rock under the impact of the waves. Most monasteries had imposing steeples, symbols of their dedication to God, and practical tools for marking the canonical hours. These steeples, as we've already mentioned about churches, were perfect targets for lightning. A document from the monastery of Cluny in France describes how a bolt of lightning struck its belfry in 1284, descending through the bell to the rope, instantly killing the novice who was pulling it to call the monks to midnight prayer. The event was interpreted as a sign that night prayers should be suspended during storms, a rare concession to physical safety over spiritual discipline. Manuscripts, the priceless treasure of medieval monasteries, were particularly vulnerable during storms. Monastic libraries often suffered from water infiltration that could destroy in minutes works that had taken decades to produce. In 1292, a severe storm caused the roof of the library in the monastery of Reichenau in present-day Germany to partially collapse. The rainwater destroyed dozens of irreplaceable manuscripts, including Greek medical texts that had survived the fall of Rome. Some historians argue that medical advances were delayed by decades because of this loss. Another aspect that is rarely considered is the question of food. Monasteries generally maintained their own gardens and animal farms, seeking self-sufficiency. A severe storm could destroy entire crops and kill animals, condemning the monastic community to starvation. Unlike towns and cities, which could receive supplies from less affected neighboring areas, isolated monasteries often had no immediate alternatives. Monastic chronicles often record periods of forced fasting after particularly destructive storms, rationalized as spiritual penance, but in reality, a pragmatic adaptation to food shortages. Oh, and the bridges, especially those medieval wooden bridges supported by pillars that could barely bear their weight on a normal day. During intense storms, the rivers would overflow the current would increase, and many of these structures would simply disappear, taking with them any unfortunates who were trying to cross, and even the seemingly sturdier stone bridges could be extremely treacherous when wet, with their soap-smooth floors. Bridges were vital arteries in medieval Europe, connecting towns, cities, and enabling trade. However, their construction was often precarious, especially in rural areas where wooden bridges were the norm. These structures, with pillars driven into the riverbed and poorly fixed wooden decks, rarely survived intense storms. One of the most frightening aspects of medieval bridges during storms was how quickly they could fail. A calm river could turn into a raging torrent in a matter of hours. The water, carrying the logs, branches, and other debris, slammed into the pillars of the bridge with increasing force. One moment, the structure seemed solid. The next, it was completely gone. There are countless tales of travelers who, caught in storms while crossing rural regions, would arrive at a river to find that the bridge that had existed there the day before had simply disappeared. Merchants lost entire shipments. Families were separated. Important messengers never reached their destination, all because a bridge couldn't withstand a single night of heavy rain. Even the seemingly more durable stone bridges had their vulnerabilities. Medieval construction techniques rarely included deep foundations or soil studies. A flood that altered the course of the river could undermine the foundations of an apparently solid bridge, causing catastrophic collapses. The historic Old Bridge of Avignon in France, made famous in the nursery rhyme, was partially destroyed by floods several times during its history. Despite its sturdy stone construction, a particular danger of medieval bridges was that many also served as housing and commercial structures. In London, Paris, and Florence, it was common to build houses and stores directly over the bridges, a way of maximizing the limited urban space. The Ponte Vecchio in Florence, which still exists today, is a surviving example of this practice. During storms, these structures faced a double danger: water damage to the river below, and rain and wind damage to the structures above. The Notre Dame Bridge in Paris, lined with houses and stores, collapsed completely during a flood in 1499, after our period, but illustrative of the vulnerability of these structures. Dozens of people died when their houses literally fell into the Seine. The disaster was so traumatic that reconstruction was only completed decades later, and the new project forbade the building of permanent housing on the structure. For medieval travelers, the decision of whether or not to cross a bridge during a storm was literally a choice between life and death. Many chose to wait for days on the bank of a river, sleeping in the open or seeking shelter in nearby villages, rather than risk crossing during or just after heavy rains. Merchants often lost valuable business opportunities because of these delays. Yet another example of how the weather controlled the medieval economy in ways we can hardly imagine today. So you're in 1297, listening to the roar of thunder and watching the lightning light up the sky as if it were day. Each crash seems closer than the last. Your house creaks and drips. Your children cry. And you pray. You pray like you've never prayed before, because in the 13th century, that's literally all you can do. There is no weather forecast to tell you when the storm will pass. There is no warning system. There is no lightning-proof construction. And there's more. The people around you aren't just scared. They're panicking. Because in 1297, a thunderstorm is not just a natural phenomenon. It's a sign, an omen. Maybe it's the end of the world. Maybe it's a punishment for the sins of the community. What if someone in the village has had a particularly bad harvest, or a child has recently been born with a deformity, or something else inexplicable has happened? Well, clearly it's someone's fault. Maybe a witch. Maybe that strange lady who lives alone at the edge of the forest. Or maybe that man who came from another village and speaks with a strange accent. The storms didn't just kill directly, they unleashed another kind of storm, that of collective hysteria, which often resulted in literal witch hunts. Someone had to be held responsible for divine wrath, and it was rarely impersonal nature. It was much easier and more satisfying to find a human scapegoat. Let's explore this dark side of the medieval mentality during severe storms. The connection between extreme weather phenomena and accusations of witchcraft is well documented by historians. A study of European court records showed that periods of particularly adverse weather, including severe storms, prolonged droughts, or exceptionally cold winters, often coincided with spikes in witchcraft prosecutions. In 1290, for example, a series of devastating storms hit the region of Bavaria. In present-day Germany, crops were destroyed, rivers overflowed, and lightning struck several churches, including one where the priest was struck down during Mass. In the following weeks, 7 women were accused of causing the storms through magic. The evidence? One of them had been seen gathering herbs during the full moon, probably for medicinal use. Another owned a black cat, and a third simply lived alone after the death of her husband. They were all executed, some burned alive, others drowned, ironically, using the same water from the flood they had supposedly caused. Medieval meteorological theory was a mixture of rudimentary empirical observation, superstition, and theology. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential medieval theologians, argued that demons could, with divine permission, manipulate the natural elements to cause storms. This was not a marginal theory, but doctrine accepted by the Church. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, an influential witch-hunting manual, published in 1486, later than our scenario, but reflecting older beliefs, devoted entire chapters to how witches supposedly caused storms, hail, and lightning. One particularly feared phenomenon was red lightning, electrical discharges that appeared reddish in color due to specific atmospheric conditions or simply altered perception due to fear. These rays were invariably interpreted as direct demonic manifestations. A 1286 chronicle from a French monastery describes a bolt of lightning, the color of blood, that struck a tree under which an elderly woman often rested. The tree was broken in half, and although the woman was not present during the storm, she was later accused of invoking the devil and executed. A particularly tragic aspect of this mentality was the fact that natural physical characteristics could make someone suspect. People with birthmarks, especially red ones, associated with fire and hell, or with physical deformities, were often the first to be accused. after natural disasters. A woman with heterochromia, different colored eyes, in a village near Toulouse, was stoned to death by neighbors after a particularly violent storm in 1294. Her demonic eyes were considered sufficient proof that she had made a pact with the devil to bring destruction to the community. Foreigners and ethnic minorities were also frequent targets. Jews, in particular, were repeatedly accused of causing storms and other natural disasters, fueling the already intense anti-Semitic sentiments of medieval Europe. In 1287, an entire Jewish community was massacred in Munich after devastating floods on charges of having poisoned wells and performed rituals to invoke storms. Although the church officially condemned taking the law into one's own hands, in practice, many local clergymen not only tolerated but encouraged this search for scapegoats. A parish priest in a small French village wrote in 1292 that, after terrible storms sent by the devil, God, in his infinite wisdom, allowed the witch responsible to be identified by marks on her body, and thus divine justice was served at the hands of faithful Christians. What if you survived the storm? The next few days wouldn't be much better. Flooded fields meant lost crops. Animals killed by lightning or drowning meant hunger in winter. Wells contaminated by floodwater meant diseases spreading fast. A single, strong storm could condemn an entire community to starvation for months to come. The aftermath of the storm was, in many ways, just as dangerous as the storm itself. Let's examine what happened after the thunder fell silent and the clouds dispersed. First, there was the immediate problem of contaminated water. Wells, the main source of drinking water in medieval communities, were often contaminated by floodwater, carrying human and animal excrement, rotting carcasses, and all kinds of debris. Without purification methods, or even a clear understanding of how diseases spread, entire communities drank contaminated water in the days following a storm. The result was predictable: devastating outbreaks of gastrointestinal diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. A chronicle from 1290 describes how, 2 weeks after a severe storm in a village near Lyon, more people died from the disease of the bowels than from the fury of the heavens themselves. Whole families went to their graves, first the young and the old, then the rest. The graves were shallow and hurried, as the grave diggers could barely keep up with the pace of death. The impact on crops was another devastating problem. Medieval Europe was permanently on the brink of famine. A single bad harvest meant shortages. 2 in a row often meant starvation. Severe storms at the wrong time of year could destroy entire cereal fields. Wheat, barley, and rye, bedraggled by rain and wind, could not be harvested efficiently with medieval tools. Even when possible, wet grain would quickly rot in barns if it wasn't dried properly, something practically impossible on a large scale without modern technology. In 1289, after a series of particularly destructive storms in northern France, a chronicler wrote, "The price of bread rose so much that the poor ate bread made from acorns, ferns, and tree bark. Desperate mothers cooked grass soup for their children. The better off closed their doors at mealtimes, fearing that the smell of food would cause riots among the hungry. Animals, essential to the medieval agrarian economy, also suffered huge losses during and after storms. In addition to direct deaths from lightning and drowning, many died in the days and weeks that followed from eating contaminated vegetation or drinking unsuitable water. The loss of a single plow ox could mean ruin for a peasant family, unable to prepare the soil for the next planting. Damaged structures created another set of post-storm problems. A house with a partially destroyed roof was vulnerable to more damage with each new rainfall. However, repair materials were scarce and expensive, especially after a widespread disaster when demand skyrocketed. Many families spent months or even years living in severely compromised homes because they simply couldn't afford to repair them properly. In cities, infrastructure problems were piling up. Damaged bridges interrupted trade routes, isolating communities, and causing shortages of essential products. Walls weakened by floods made cities more vulnerable to enemy attacks. A constant worry in times of frequent conflict. There are records of timely sieges launched against cities recently hit by severe storms, when the attackers knew the defenses would be compromised. One aspect that is often overlooked is the psychological impact of these catastrophes. With no scientific understanding of the phenomena involved, each storm reinforced the feeling of vulnerability and powerlessness. Constant anxiety about when the next disaster would strike permeated everyday life. Chronicles from the time describe people developing what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, becoming pathologically fearful of dark clouds or the sound of thunder, unable to sleep during rainy nights, or developing elaborate superstitious rituals in the hope of preventing further storms. Let's be honest, you, used to your air conditioning, your full fridge, your Netflix, and your Uber Eats, wouldn't last a day in the Middle Ages, and a thunderstorm would be the least of your problems. But maybe that's why we still talk so much about those times, to remember how far we've come, how much we've achieved in terms of safety and comfort. Let's talk about some specific places you definitely wouldn't want to be during a storm in 1297. The seas and oceans, for example. If you think storms were scary on dry land, imagine facing them at sea on a medieval ship. Ships in the 13th century were extremely vulnerable to storms, with no meteorological instruments to predict weather changes, no radio communication to receive warnings, and no engines to navigate against adverse winds. Medieval sailors were completely at the mercy of the elements. Vessels like the medieval kokas, common in the North Sea and Baltic trade, or the Mediterranean galleys, had limited navigation capabilities during storms. Their hulls, although robust for the time, were not designed to withstand gigantic waves. Navigation depended almost exclusively on sails or oars in the case of galleys, making them practically ungovernable during strong and erratic winds. Records from the Hanseatic League, a powerful trade federation in Northern Europe, indicate that it was common to lose 10% to 20% of ships every year to storms, a risk considered normal for maritime trade. In particularly severe years, entire fleets disappeared without a trace. An account from 1288 describes how a merchant fleet of 14 ships set sail from Lubeck for England. A sudden storm in the North Sea sank 11 of them. Of the 3 that survived, 2 were so badly damaged that they had to be abandoned when they reached port. Only one completed its originally planned commercial voyage. Superstitions among sailors were particularly intense. Many refused to sail on certain days considered to be bad omens, or performed elaborate rituals before setting sail. Some ships carried storm stones, stones with natural holes that supposedly had the power to calm the winds when hung from the mast. Others relied on amulets made of coral or amber, believing that these materials had magical properties against storms. The crew of a ship hit by a medieval storm had few options. Raising the sails to reduce the surface area exposed to the wind was the most common action. But this also meant losing maneuverability. Throwing cargo overboard to increase buoyancy was another desperate tactic. Goods that represented the investment of entire lives were sacrificed in the hope of survival. For the passengers and crew, the experience was indescribable. Without proper lighting, the interior of a ship during a night storm was almost complete darkness, occasionally interrupted by the frightening flashes of lightning, the roar of the ice, wind, and waves, the creaking of the wood of the hull under pressure, the screams of the sailors, and the groans of the seasick passengers created an infernal cacophony. Medieval mines were another particularly dangerous place during storms. Already dangerous under normal conditions, they became death traps when heavy rains hit the region. The mining techniques of the time were rudimentary, with little or no consideration for proper drainage or structural reinforcement against flooding. Mines of coal, silver, tin, and other minerals often filled up quickly during heavy rains. Miners, working at the deepest levels, rarely received warnings in time, being surprised by the rapidly rising water. In 1286, a silver mine in Freiburg, in present-day Germany, flooded during a sudden storm, killing 27 miners who were trapped in a dead-end tunnel. Even when they managed to escape the immediate flood, the miners faced the additional danger of landslides and collapses. The waterlogged ground lost stability, causing seemingly safe tunnels to collapse. A chronicle of the Cornwall region of England, famous for its tin mines, describes how, after a week of heavy rain in 1294, 3 different mines collapsed on the same day, burying alive men who had survived the waters, only to be claimed by the earth. The problem was not limited to the acute phase of the storm. Flooded mines often remained inaccessible for weeks or months. Without efficient mechanical pumps, the only way to remove the water was through buckets passed from hand to hand in human chains, an incredibly slow and laborious process. Meanwhile, families who depended on mining to survive faced starvation. To make matters worse, stagnant water from abandoned mines often seeped into groundwater, contaminating drinking water. Sources with toxic minerals, such as arsenic, lead, and mercury, commonly present in mineral deposits. Entire communities suffered chronic poisoning without understanding its cause, attributing the resulting illnesses to miasmas or divine punishments. Medieval forests, which covered much larger portions of Europe than today, were also extremely dangerous places during storms. These were not the managed forests we know today, but vast, dense, and little explored wildernesses The most obvious danger was that of falling trees. Without modern forest management, many old or diseased trees remained standing until a storm brought them down, often on unfortunate travelers who sought shelter under their canopies. An account from 1290 describes how a group of pilgrims, caught in a storm while crossing the Black Forest in Germany, lost 7 of their members when an ancient oak tree collapsed on their makeshift camp. Another danger was the rapid flooding of low-lying areas. Forests located in valleys or near rivers could turn into lakes in a matter of hours when heavy rains hit the region. Travelers unfamiliar with the local topography often found themselves surrounded by rapidly rising waters, with no obvious escape routes and no visible landmarks for orientation. Disorientation was a serious problem. In dense forests without clearly marked trails, travelers often lost their sense of direction completely during storms. Without reliable compasses or detailed maps, many wandered in circles until they succumbed to exhaustion, hypothermia, or hunger. Medieval chronicles are full of stories of travelers found dead a few kilometers from towns or roads, victims not of the storm directly, but of the disorientation it caused. And we can't forget the beliefs about forests. In the medieval mindset, forests were not just natural environments, but the domains of supernatural beings, fairies, elves, spirits, and demons. A storm in a forest was interpreted as a battle between these mystical forces, with humans as unfortunate collateral damage. Many travelers, already terrified by the natural elements, were driven to complete panic by the conviction that they were witnessing or being the target of supernatural phenomena. Reports of wild hunts, ghostly processions of spectral horsemen supposedly riding during storms, were particularly common. It was believed that any unfortunate who witnessed this manifestation was doomed to be snatched away and eternally join the hunt. It's not hard to imagine how howling winds, flashes of lightning, illuminating silhouettes of trees, and the distant sound of breaking branches could feed such beliefs in minds already predisposed to the supernatural. One specific type of forest deserves special mention: mangroves and coastal swamps. These transition zones between land and sea were particularly lethal during storms. In addition to the dangers common to other forests, they faced the additional problem of storm tides, abnormal rises in sea level caused by a combination of strong winds and low atmospheric pressure. Communities living close to these environments, usually dependent on fishing and shellfish gathering, were particularly vulnerable. An account from 1291 describes how an entire village on the coast of Friesland, present-day Holland, was swallowed up by the sea during the stormy night, leaving no trace beyond a church bell that can sometimes be heard ringing beneath the waves when the sea is calm. Probably a reference to the permanent submergence of the area due to coastal erosion accelerated by a particularly severe storm. Battlefields were another particularly horrible place to be. During the storm in 1297, wars didn't stop because of bad weather. In fact, storms often coincided with decisive moments in medieval conflicts, sometimes determining their outcome more effectively than the commander's strategy. Medieval soldiers, already suffering from heavy armor, found their mobility even more compromised when the battlefield turned into mud. Knights, the elite element of medieval armies, became particularly vulnerable. A horse mired in mud was a death sentence for its rider, unable to move quickly in his heavy armor, and now exposed to enemy archers or infantry. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, later than our scenario, but illustrative, was partly decided by a sudden storm. English archers kept their bowstrings dry under waxed cloaks, while Genoese crossbowmen, fighting on the French side, saw their crossbow strings stretch and lose tension in the humidity, drastically reducing their range and power. This is just one example of how adverse weather conditions could completely alter the balance of power in a medieval conflict. Military camps turned into nightmares during prolonged storms. Primitive tents offered little protection against heavy rains. Provisions spoiled quickly when wet, especially bread, the staple food of medieval armies. Diseases spread like wildfire among troops forced to huddle in makeshift shelters, often killing more soldiers than the enemy. A chronicler describing the siege of a Flemish city in 1294 reported that more men died of fever and flux, dysentery, than by sword or arrow, for the heavens opened for 20 days without ceasing, turning the camp into a fetid swamp where men slept in the mud like pigs, only to wake up sicker every morning if they woke up at all. Weapons and armor, often made of metal, suffered from accelerated oxidation. A rusty sword or armor could mean the difference between life and death in the next confrontation. Soldiers spent precious hours trying to dry and preserve their equipment, often without adequate success. Wet armor also increased the risk of hypothermia, a constant danger in autumn and spring campaigns. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of storms on medieval battlefields was their psychological impact. In a deeply superstitious age, entire armies could lose morale by interpreting a particularly severe storm as a divine sign of disapproval. There are reports of commanders postponing battles or even abandoning entire campaigns after being hit by storms interpreted as negative omens. Ironically, ships stationed in ports were not necessarily safer than those on the open sea. Medieval ports rarely offered the protection that their modern equivalents do. Breakwaters were rudimentary or non-existent, and anchoring techniques left much to be desired. The port of Genoa, one of the most important in the medieval Mediterranean, lost 93 ships during a single storm in 1289. Most were anchored in the port, supposedly in safety. Accounts from the time describe how the ships, torn from their moorings by the combined force of wind and waves, crashed into each other and into the quays, shattering like eggshells until the harbor was full of wreckage, goods, and floating bodies. River ports faced the additional danger of flash floods. Overflowing rivers could sweep anchored ships away from their moorings, throwing them against bridges or banks with devastating force. An account from 1295 describes how the River Seine in Paris rose so quickly during a storm that boats moored the night before were found in the morning on the roofs of riverside houses, as if giants had placed them there. For sailors and port workers, storms meant not only immediate danger, but potential economic ruin. Lost ships represented huge investments that disappeared literally overnight. Goods damaged by water, Especially valuable items such as silk, spices, and manuscripts could lose their value completely. There was no maritime insurance, as we know it today. Losses were fully absorbed by the owners. An often overlooked aspect of the impact of storms on medieval ports was their long-term effect on coastal geography. A single severe storm could permanently alter the coastline, blocking channels with sediment or opening up new ones. Prosperous ports could become inaccessible overnight, condemning entire towns to economic decline. The port town of Winchelsea in England had to be completely abandoned and rebuilt on higher ground after devastating storms in 1287 and 1288 permanently destroyed its original harbor. This reminds us of the fragility of medieval coastal settlements as a whole. Without modern erosion containment techniques or protection from storm tides, coastal towns and cities were at the mercy of the sea. There are records of dozens of entire communities literally swallowed by the sea during severe storms along the North Sea coast in the 13th and 14th centuries. Perhaps the most dramatic example is the legendary town of Rungholt on the coast of North Frisia, now Germany. A thriving trading town in the 13th century, it was completely destroyed during the Great Flood of St. Marcellus in 1362, later than our scenario, but illustrative. Not only were the buildings destroyed, the very land on which the town stood disappeared beneath the waves. Rungholt became the Atlantis of the North Sea, a powerful symbol of human vulnerability in the face of the fury of the elements. Another particularly vulnerable place during storms were salt pans, coastal areas where salt was extracted from seawater through evaporation. Economically crucial, salt was the main food preservative in the pre-refrigeration era. These operations were extremely vulnerable to flooding by fresh water from rain or storm tides. A 1293 record from the French Atlantic coast describes how a night of celestial fury destroyed the work of 3 stations, flooding the basins with rainwater and breaking down the barriers that protected against the sea. Families that had been prosperous the day before found themselves reduced to beggary by morning. Mountainous regions presented their own unique set of dangers during medieval storms. Narrow gorges and valleys, often the only viable routes through mountain ranges, could turn into flash flood channels. Travelers, pilgrims, and merchants were often surprised by walls of water pouring down from the slopes, with no time to seek higher ground. The Alps, Europe's main mountain barrier, and a crucial route for trade between northern Europe and Italy, were particularly dangerous. An account from 1289 describes how a caravan of 37 merchants and their mules carrying cloth from Flanders to Milan was completely swept away by a flash flood while crossing an alpine valley. Neither men, nor animals, nor goods were ever found, the chronicler reports, as if the mountain itself had swallowed them up. Landslides were another constant danger in mountainous regions. During periods of heavy rain, saturated soil lost cohesion, especially in areas cleared for agriculture or grazing. A common practice, even on steep slopes. Entire villages could disappear under tons of mud and rock in a matter of minutes. In 1296, just a year before our main scenario, a village near Lucerne, in present-day Switzerland, was partially buried by a landslide. After a week of heavy rain, survivors reported that the sound of the mountain moving was like 1,000 demons roaring at once. Those who ran north survived. Those who hesitated or ran in any other direction were buried alive. Mountain monasteries and hermitages, often built in isolated and precarious locations for spiritual reasons, were particularly vulnerable. A Benedictine monastery built on a cliff in the Pyrenees was broken in half like a loaf of bread, in the words of a contemporary chronicler, when part of the mountain collapsed during a storm in 1288. All 23 monks perished. Isolation made rescue virtually impossible. Villages hit by landslides or floods were often cut off for weeks or months. Survivors had to rely exclusively on their own resources until conditions allowed travel again. A moving account from 1291 describes how, after a landslide isolated an alpine village, the few survivors lived on roots and the meat of a single ox that survived for 7 weeks until the snow melted enough to allow them to descend into the valley. Paradoxically, the thaw after winter storms created its own dangers. Avalanches regularly devastated alpine communities, often triggered by rains that destabilized layers of accumulated snow. A record from 1285 describes how the snow came down from the mountain with the roar of 1,000 lions, burying 27 houses and the chapel until nothing could be seen but a white expanse where there had once been a village. At the other climatic extreme, deserts and steppes also presented deadly dangers during storms. Although we might associate these regions mainly with aridity, sudden storms could turn dry riverbeds, wadis, into deadly torrents in a matter of minutes. Entire caravans were regularly caught in these floods, especially as camps were often set up on these dry riverbeds, precisely because they offered flat ground and protection from the wind. An account by a Venetian merchant traveling through North Africa in 1290 describes how the sky opened without warning, although there were no clouds visible where we were. Before we could move our belongings, a wall of water descended on us, sweeping away men, camels, and goods like dry leaves. Of the 43 of us, only I and 6 others survived, clinging to rocks as the world seemed to end around us. Sandstorms, a different but equally terrifying phenomenon, presented another set of dangers. Without weather forecasts or an understanding of the precursory signs, caravans often found themselves in the middle of these devastating events without warning. Visibility reduced to 0 led to fatal separations. Caravan members who strayed just a few meters could never find their way back to the group. A particularly vivid account comes from a pilgrim returning from Mecca in 1283. The air turned yellow, then brown, then black as night. The sand penetrated every opening, no matter how small. Eyes, noses, mouths, clothes. To breathe was to drink sand. Seeing was impossible. To speak was to fill your mouth with sand. Many simply lay down and allowed the desert to bury them alive, preferring a quick death to prolonged torture. Let's go back to medieval cities for a moment, specifically to an aspect that is rarely discussed: Jewish neighborhoods or Judearias. These communities, often confined to specific areas by discriminatory laws, were particularly vulnerable during natural disasters, including severe storms. Jewish quarters were often allocated to less desirable areas of cities, low-lying land prone to flooding, near walls that could collapse, or on unstable slopes. When storms caused damage to these areas, Jewish communities rarely received the same assistance as Christian neighborhoods. Worse still, natural disasters often triggered outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence. The medieval mentality, looking for scapegoats for inexplicable catastrophes, often blamed religious minorities. There are countless records of pogroms, organized attacks against Jewish communities, occurring in the wake of storms, floods, or other natural disasters. In 1287, for example, the Jewish quarter of Andernach in present-day Germany was attacked after a severe storm that coincided with Passover. Rumors spread that the Jews had poisoned the air or performed blasphemous rituals that attracted divine wrath. Dozens were killed, and the synagogue was burned down. Ironically, one of the few buildings that had withstood the original storm. Social vulnerability extended beyond Jewish communities. Neighborhoods of prostitution, areas inhabited by foreigners, or communities of trades considered impure, such as tanners or butchers, often suffered similar discrimination after natural disasters. A record from 1294 describes how, after devastating floods in Bruges, in present-day Belgium, the neighborhood of the Lombards, Italian bankers, was attacked by the mob, who shouted that their usury had offended God and caused the waters to rise. Another aspect rarely considered is the impact of severe storms on medieval prison systems. Prisons, often located in towers or dungeons, were particularly vulnerable to both lightning and flooding. Prisoners, literally chained and unable to seek safety, were among the most helpless victims during storms. An account from 1285 describes how the dungeons of Carlisle Castle in England flooded during a particularly intense storm. 17 prisoners, chained to the walls, died like rats in a trap, the water rising slowly until their cries ceased one by one. The event was interpreted not as an architectural flaw, but as divine justice manifested through the elements. A convenient perspective that absolved the authorities of any responsibility. The medieval mentality often saw natural disasters as tools of divine justice, which led to disturbing interpretations of who deserved to survive. When storms hit prisons, convents, or other places of confinement, the resulting deaths were often rationalized as deserved punishments, not avoidable tragedies. Women's convents and monasteries faced particular challenges during severe storms. Strict cloister rules meant that, even when in mortal danger, many nuns hesitated to leave their convents without explicit permission from ecclesiastical superiors. Permission that often came too late or never at all. A particularly moving account comes from a Benedictine convent near Toulouse. Hit by floods in 1290, the abbess, fearful of violating the cloister more than the rising waters, gathered the sisters in the chapel on the upper floor, and there they remained in prayer while the waters rose, until the building itself gave way, sending them to their deaths while singing hymns. The chronicler adds that their bodies were found days later, still in a position of prayer, their hands joined even in death. A powerful image that reinforced the ideal of devotion to the end. but which for modern sensibilities represents an absolutely avoidable tragedy. Medieval roads and pilgrimage routes became death traps during storms. Without proper paving, drainage, or sturdy bridges, they became virtually impassable. Pilgrims, merchants, and messengers often found themselves trapped between flooded stretches, unable to move forward or return. The Way of St. James, one of the most important pilgrimage routes in medieval Europe, crossed particularly dangerous terrain in the Pyrenees. An account from 1291 describes how a group of German pilgrims, surprised by a storm while crossing the Roncesvalles Pass, were swept off the face of the mountain like ants from a table, some falling into ravines, others swept away by landslides, until of 60, only 7 remained. A particularly cruel aspect of medieval reality was that travelers in distress could rarely count on help from strangers. Fear of bandits, who often disguised themselves as travelers in distress to lure victims, meant that many ignored genuine calls for help. Chronicles are full of accounts of travelers who died within sight of villages or farms because the locals refused to open their doors during storms. The famous Benedictine rule of hospitality, which obliged monasteries to shelter travelers, was one of the few reliable protections for those caught in storms far from home. An account from 1294 describes how the monastery of Fountains in England sheltered more than 200 travelers during a prolonged storm, feeding them their own meager rations and allowing them to sleep in the cloister and church, although the abbot feared that the weight of so many people might cause the roof to collapse. Medieval roads were particularly vulnerable to another destructive phenomenon: mudflows. When heavy rains saturated slopes cleared for agriculture, the soil lost cohesion and slid as a semi-liquid mass, following the path of least resistance, often the roads themselves, which acted as natural gutters. A record from 1286 describes how a caravan of merchants was surprised by a brown wave taller than a mounted man while traveling through a valley in Tuscany. The mud moved like water, but weighed like stone. Men and animals were swallowed up in moments, with no chance to escape or even scream for help. Even inland water transportation systems, such as canals and navigable rivers, became extremely dangerous during storms. Primitive gates failed under the pressure of rising waters, creating sudden waves that swept away unprepared vessels. Locks overflowed, often dragging boaters to their deaths. A report from 1289 describes how the canal system near Bruges overflowed its banks as if the sea had invaded the land. Barges were found in the treetops. So high had the waters carried them. Of 30 vessels sailing the day before, only 7 were found, and many of them so badly damaged that they would never sail again. Communication in times of crisis was another, almost insurmountable challenge in medieval times. Without telephones, radios, or the internet, warnings about impending storms or approaching floods rarely arrived in time to allow evacuations. Messengers on horseback, the fastest method of communication, were precisely the most vulnerable during adverse weather conditions. A particularly tragic account comes from 1293, when the Loire River in France began to rise rapidly after intense storms in the mountains. Messengers were sent to warn villages downstream, but The waters traveled faster than the fastest horses. When the alarm came, the messenger was often followed minutes later by the flood itself. Castles, which we mentioned earlier as vulnerable, despite their apparent solidity, presented another specific problem during prolonged storms. Food supply. Designed to withstand sieges, they paradoxically became traps during natural disasters. When drawbridges and access roads were destroyed by floods or landslides, castles could be isolated for weeks. A record from 1295 describes how Coucy Castle in France was isolated for almost a month after devastating storms. The nobles first ate the meat of the horses, then the hounds, and finally shared rations with the servants, eating bread made from sawdust and herbs picked from the walls. When they were finally rescued, many had died of starvation, and the survivors were so weak they could barely walk. Another aspect that is often overlooked is the impact of storms on important religious and civic events. Processions, fairs, tournaments, and other events that gathered large crowds outdoors could turn into scenes of tragedy when sudden storms hit. In 1284, a Corpus Christi procession in Siena, Italy, was surprised by a violent storm. The crowd, estimated to number in the thousands, panicked, seeking shelter in nearby churches. In the resulting confusion, dozens were trampled to death. The event was interpreted as a sign that God disapproved of the excessive opulence of the celebration. Again, an explanation that deflected responsibility from practical issues, such as the lack of adequate shelters or evacuation plans. Medieval fairs, vital centers of international trade, were particularly vulnerable. Temporary tents and stalls offered little protection against severe storms. Valuable goods, often unprotected, could be ruined in minutes. An account of the famous Champagne Fair in 1288 describes how a storm sent by the devil destroyed in an hour riches that would have taken years to recover. Fine fabrics from Flanders, silks from Venice, spices from the Orient, all turned to mud under the feet of men who fled like frightened rats. Tournaments, crucial events in medieval, knightly culture, often brought together hundreds or thousands of spectators in open fields. When storms hit, chaos was inevitable. An account of a tournament near Paris in 1293 describes how the sky darkened in the middle of the day, as if night had come prematurely. Lightning fell among the knights still armed, turning them into human torches as their armor attracted the celestial fire. Noble ladies in their fine dresses were dragged through the mud, indistinguishable from the humblest peasants. Medieval universities, centers of knowledge in cities like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, faced their own challenges during severe storms. Valuable manuscripts, many of them unique copies of ancient texts, were extremely vulnerable to water. Libraries often suffered irreparable damage during storms with leaking roofs. A report from the University of Paris in 1290 laments that the rain penetrated the roof of the library as if it were made of cloth, not stone. Scrolls that had survived for centuries were destroyed in one night. Works by Aristotle, commentaries by saints, medical treatises, all ruined by the falling water, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the loss of knowledge. University students, often living in rented rooms of dubious quality, were particularly vulnerable to structural collapse during storms. A record from Oxford in 1287 mentions that 7 students perished when the house where they lived collapsed. During the stormy night, its walls weakened by rains that lasted a fortnight without interruption. The impact of storms on medieval public health deserves special consideration. Without proper sewage systems, clean piped water, or an understanding of germ theory, severe storms often triggered catastrophic health crises. Wells contaminated by floods became vectors for diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. A medical record from Montpellier in 1294 notes that more died from the water they drank after the rains than from the very water that flooded their homes. Death entered their mouths, disguised as the very source of life. Flooded cemeteries presented another terrible risk to public health. Shallow burials, common practice especially after events with multiple deaths, meant that floods often exposed partially decomposed corpses. A particularly graphic account from 1289 describes how, after flooding in a northern Italian town, recently buried bodies were torn from their graves and carried through the streets like grotesque logs, some still recognizable to the horrified relatives who watched them float by. Even domestic heating methods became deadly during prolonged storms, with rudimentary chimneys often blocked by birds' nests or damaged by strong winds. The risk of carbon monoxide poisoning increased dramatically. Entire families were found dead in their beds, apparently sleeping peacefully, victims of smoke that returned into the houses instead of escaping through the roofs. A doctor from Florence wrote in 1291 about the silent death that comes during storms when families light fires to combat the cold and damp, only to be suffocated by the invisible poisoned air that cannot escape through the blocked chimneys. I met 7 such families this winter, all appearing to be asleep, but cold as the very death that took them without warning. Food storage, already precarious in normal times, became almost impossible during prolonged storms. Flooded barns meant ruined grain. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products spoiled quickly in damp, hot environments. A 1286 record of a monastery in the south of France laments that after 7 days of incessant rain, all the bread was covered in green mold. The meat smelled like carrion, and even the wine had gone sour in its barrels. The monks ate wild herbs gathered between the rains, like grazing animals. Let's consider an aspect that is rarely discussed: the impact of severe storms on medieval mental health. With no scientific understanding of the phenomena involved, every thunderclap, every flash of lightning, every flood carried cosmic and often threatening significance. Medieval chronicles regularly describe individuals who developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress after surviving particularly violent storms. One account from 1288 mentions a lightning survivor who never slept again when clouds covered the sky, spending whole nights in terrified vigil, trembling at each distant thunderclap like a leaf in the wind. Entire communities developed elaborate and often bizarre rituals in the hope of preventing future storms. In some regions, children were forced to fast or perform public penance, believing that their relative innocence made them more effective intercessors with God. A record from 1289 describes how, after devastating storms, a village in southern Germany made all children under the age of 10 walk barefoot around the church 3 times before dawn every day during a full moon, singing hymns and carrying candles to appease the angry heavens. The impact on the social fabric was equally profound. Severe storms often exacerbated existing tensions, leading to outbursts of violence or community fragmentation. A particularly revealing record comes from a small town in Lombardy, where after devastating floods in 1292, neighbors who, for years, had shared bread and salt now fought like dogs for every piece of dry land, every unrotted beam, every usable stone. Friendships of decades were broken in a day, never repaired, even after the waters receded. Medieval medicine, already limited under normal circumstances, became almost impotent in the face of the consequences of severe storms. Trained doctors, rare even in the largest cities, were completely non-existent in most rural areas. Injuries and illnesses that today we would consider treatable often resulted in death or permanent disability. A doctor from Bologna wrote in 1294 about his frustration after a particularly destructive storm. For every patient I can help, 20 die for lack of knowledge or resources. Bones broken by falling structures become gangrenous for lack of proper treatment. Simple wounds become infected and kill. Children die of fevers that I could treat if I had access to the necessary herbs. Now, all destroyed by the flood, the very supply of medicines was severely compromised by storms. Medicinal herb gardens, maintained by monasteries and doctors, were often destroyed. Disrupted trade routes meant that imported ingredients, essential for many medieval treatments, became inaccessible just when they were needed most. An apothecary in Venice lamented in 1287 that after the storms that sank 3 ships from the Levant, there is no aloe to treat fevers, no myrrh for wounds, no cinnamon to strengthen the weak. We prescribe prayers where, before we offered remedies, for our vials are as empty as our hopes. The aftermath of the storm brought another threat often ignored in modern descriptions: population explosions of venomous animals and pests. Rats, forced out of their underground hiding places by flooding, invaded human spaces in unprecedented numbers. Snakes, spiders, and other venomous animals, similarly displaced, created additional risks for already vulnerable populations. A particularly vivid account comes from a monastery in the south of France. In 1290, after the waters subsided, the rats came in such numbers as had never been seen. Not even in the plagues of Egypt described in Scripture. They devoured any remaining food, bit sleeping children, and even the cats fled from their multitude. Then came the snakes, seeking out the mice, entering houses and beds. Many who survived the storm died from the poison of these unwelcome visitors. Even something as basic as dry clothes became a luxury during and after prolonged storms. Without efficient drying methods, especially during periods of prolonged humidity, people from all walks of life faced the discomfort and danger of permanently damp clothing. Hypothermia even in relatively mild climates, killed countless victims already weakened by hunger or disease. A medieval physician observed in 1288 that many who survived the initial fury of the heavens succumbed days later to the cold embrace of death, their bodies unable to keep warm, wrapped in linen and wool that never completely dries. Death comes silently in sleep, especially to the very young and the very old. The impact on children deserves special attention, particularly vulnerable both physically and psychologically. Medieval children often suffered deep and lasting trauma after severe storms. Orphans created by natural disasters rarely found adequate institutional support, depending on the often overburdened charity of relatives, neighbors, or religious institutions. A moving account from 1289 describes orphans after a particularly devastating flood. Children wandered through the ruins, calling for parents who would never answer. Some, so small they could barely speak, were found days later, surviving like wild animals, drinking water from puddles, and eating anything they could find. Even those taken in by relatives or the church carried the empty gaze of those who had seen horrors too great for their tender age. And finally, let's consider perhaps the scariest of all places to be during a storm in 1297, in labor. Childbirth, already dangerous in ideal circumstances, became exponentially more risky during severe storms. Midwives, essential for the survival of mothers and babies, were often unable to reach parturients when roads became impassable. Sanitary conditions, already precarious, deteriorated completely when clean water became inaccessible. A particularly moving record from 1292 describes how Marguerite, the miller's wife, went into labor during the worst storm in living memory. The midwife, hindered by the overflowing river, could not get there in time. Neighbors helped as best they could, but without adequate knowledge. The child was stillborn, and the mother followed her into the next world before dawn, both buried in the same small coffin when the waters finally receded. The combination of extreme stress, unsanitary conditions, and inadequate care resulted in maternal and infant mortality rates skyrocketing during and after severe storms. A study of parish records from a French diocese showed that childbirth mortality more than doubled in the months following particularly destructive storms. For women who survived childbirth during storms, another challenge presented itself: breastfeeding and caring for newborns in conditions of extreme scarcity. An account from 1293 mentions that after the floods, many mothers did not produce enough milk due to hunger and the constant cold. Babies languished in the helpless arms of their mothers, who chewed hard bread to make porridge that could replace the missing milk. So you're in 1297, listening to the roar of thunder and watching the lightning light up the sky as if it were day. Each crash seems closer than the last. Your house creaks and drips. Your children cry. And you pray. You pray like you've never prayed before, because in the 13th century, that's literally all you can do. There is no weather forecast to tell you when the storm will pass. There is no warning system. There is no lightning-proof construction. And there's more. The people around you aren't just scared. They're panicking. Because in 1297, A thunderstorm is not just a natural phenomenon. It's a sign, an omen. Maybe it's the end of the world. Maybe it's a punishment for the sins of the community. What if someone in the village has had a particularly bad harvest? Or a child has recently been born with a deformity? Or something else inexplicable has happened? Well, clearly it's someone's fault. Maybe a witch. Maybe that strange lady who lives alone at the edge of the forest. Or maybe that man who came from another village and speaks with a strange accent. The storms didn't just kill directly, they unleashed another kind of storm, that of collective hysteria, which often resulted in a literal witch hunts. Someone had to be held responsible for divine wrath, and it was rarely impersonal nature. It was much easier and more satisfying to find a human scapegoat. The social aspect of the storm is just as dangerous as its physical aspect. Let's explore this further. Social cohesion, already fragile in many medieval communities, often shattered completely under the pressure of natural disasters. Neighbors who normally cooperated in normal times competed fiercely for scarce resources. A perceptive observer in 1291 noted that the worst of men emerged during the worst storms. Those who on sunny days attended Mass and shared their tables with neighbors turned into wolves when the clouds darkened, stealing, lying, and even killing to ensure the survival of their own families. The tension between social classes, always present in highly stratified medieval society, often exploded after severe storms. Peasants, observing how the nobles suffered less due to their more solid buildings and food reserves, occasionally revolted against the established order. An account from 1289 describes how, after devastating floods that completely destroyed peasant homes while only superficially damaging the local castle, the serfs armed themselves with scythes and pitchforks, demanding that the manorial granaries be opened to all. When the lord refused, they attacked the castle, only to be massacred by the men-at-arms. The survivors were hanged as an example, although their only motivation was to feed hungry children. The feudal lords, for their part, often feared revolts precisely during these moments of crisis, and responded with preventive repression. A chronicler wrote in 1294 that, after the great storm, the count forbade any gathering of more than 3 men, even to repair damaged houses or recover lost belongings, fearing that the misery of the people would turn into anger against him. Or, in towns and cities, storms often exacerbated tensions between different guilds or professional groups. A 1290 record of a Flemish town describes how weavers and dyers fought openly in the streets over dry wood after the floods, each group accusing the other of hoarding essential resources. 3 men died before the authorities managed to restore order. Even family relationships could disintegrate under the extreme pressure. A particularly disturbing account from 1286 mentions that after losing everything in the storm, the blacksmith abandoned his wife and children during the night, taking with him the few coins and bread that remained. Many other men did the same, preferring to seek their fortune alone rather than watch their families suffer without being able to help effectively. The situation of women, already precarious in medieval society, became even more vulnerable during crises. Widows created by storms often lost property rights to male relatives of the deceased husband, even when the law technically protected them. A legal record from 1292 mentions that after her husband's death in the Great Storm, Agnes was driven from her home by the deceased's brother before the body was even buried. When she sought justice with a local magistrate, she was ignored because her brother-in-law had offered gifts to the judge. For children, the psychological impact was particularly severe and long-lasting. An astute observer noted in 1293 that the children who survived the Great Flood never played in the same way again. Their games became gloomy, imitating death and destruction instead of the usual dances and songs of childhood. Many screamed in their sleep for years after the event, reliving the terror in dreams they could not escape. Religious faith, a central pillar of medieval life, could be both strengthened and destroyed by catastrophic storms. Some survivors reported mystical experiences during the most intense moment of the storm, visions of saints, angels, or the Virgin Mary who had supposedly protected them. Others fundamentally questioned their faith, unable to reconcile the image of a loving God with the seemingly random destruction they had witnessed. A parish priest wrote in 1291, after a particularly devastating storm, some of the survivors became so devout that they spent whole days in church, fasting until they were sick, scourging themselves in penance for imaginary sins that they believed had caused the catastrophe. Others abandoned their faith altogether, refusing to enter the church, or even blaspheming openly, asking how a merciful God could allow innocent children to die so horribly. The economic life, already precarious, often collapsed completely. Local markets, essential for the distribution of food and other essential goods, could cease to function for weeks or months. An account from 1288 notes that after the floods, the weekly market that had functioned uninterruptedly for 200 years ceased completely. There were no sellers, no buyers, no products to sell, and no coins to buy. Each family struggled alone to survive, as in the most primitive times before civilization. Population displacement created additional tensions. Families forced to abandon destroyed homes often sought refuge in neighboring communities, where they were not always welcomed. A record from 1293 mentions that refugees from the flooded village were prevented from entering the neighboring town by armed guards who feared that they would bring disease or deplete already scarce resources. Many died of exposure to the elements, camped outside the walls that could have offered protection. Crime inevitably increased. Bandits and looters saw severe storms as golden opportunities, attacking abandoned properties or weakened communities. An account from 1289 describes how, after the storm, bands of desperate men roamed the roads, attacking travelers and raiding isolated farms. Many were formerly honest men, turned into criminals by hunger and desperation. In contrast to this social disintegration, storms also occasionally generated extraordinary examples of altruism and self-sacrifice. Chronicles mention individuals who risked or lost their own lives to save others, often strangers. A particularly moving account from 1290 describes how the miller, seeing the dam about to break, rode through the stormy night to warn villages downstream, even though he knew he would not make it back in time to save his own family. His body was found days later, still clinging to the reins of his drowned horse, but his warning saved hundreds. The communities that survived catastrophic storms best were usually those with the most robust social structures before the disaster. An astute observer noted in 1294 that in villages where the custom of mutual aid was strong, where communal granaries existed, and where decisions were made collectively, the suffering after the storm was remarkably less, even when the physical destruction was just as severe. This observation reminds us of a crucial fact about natural disasters, both medieval and modern. The human impact is rarely determined exclusively by the severity of the natural event, but mainly by the social, economic, and political structures that exist before, during, and after the event. What if you survived the storm? The next few days wouldn't be much better. Flooded fields meant lost crops. Animals killed by lightning or drowning meant hunger. In winter, wells contaminated by floodwater meant diseases spreading fast. A single, strong storm could condemn an entire community to starvation for months to come. Recovery, when it occurred, was a painfully slow process by modern standards. Without insurance, without coordinated government assistance, without rapid construction technologies, communities could take years, or even decades, to fully recover from particularly devastating storms. A chronicler observed in 1296, 7 years after a catastrophic storm, where once there was a thriving village of 40 families, now only 12 houses have been rebuilt. The fields that once produced enough wheat to feed 100 people now barely support 30. The church remains a stone skeleton without a roof, with masses celebrated under the open sky when the weather permits. The cultural memory of severe storms persisted for generations. Names were given to particularly devastating storms, which became temporal landmarks in local histories. Before the Great Storm, or 3 years after St. John's flood, songs, poems, and stories preserved the collective memory of these events, often with supernatural or moral elements added to make sense of the seemingly meaningless. Let's be honest, you, used to your air conditioning, your full fridge, your Netflix, and your Uber Eats, wouldn't last a day in the Middle Ages, and a thunderstorm would be the least of your problems. But maybe that's why we still talk so much about those times, to remember how far we've come, how much we've achieved in terms of safety and comfort. The next time you're comfortably watching a storm from your window, with a hot cup of tea in your hands, and the certainty that your roof won't collapse, remember your ancestors from 1297. For them, every clap of thunder could be the last sound they hear. Every flash of lightning could be the last light they see. Every drop of rain could be part of the flood that would sweep away everything they knew. Our current safety and comfort is not only the result of technological advances, but also of centuries of development of social institutions, warning systems, building codes, resilient agricultural practices, and scientific understanding of natural phenomena. Every aspect of modern life that protects us during storms represents the accumulated learning of countless past tragedies. In 1297, you prayed during a storm because it was literally the only thing you could do. Today, you can check the weather, radar, adjust your thermostat, call emergency services if necessary, and trust that your house is built to withstand substantial wind and rain. The difference is not just one of comfort, but of human agency, our ability to understand, predict, and mitigate the impacts of natural forces that our ancestors could only fear as manifestations of divine wrath. Now let's talk about some of the most terrible places to be during a medieval storm. And there's still a lot to be explored on this subject. So, if you're still awake, let's continue our journey through this stormy past. Let's talk about medieval leprosaria during storms. These institutions, usually located on the outskirts of cities and towns, were isolated for obvious reasons: fear of contagion. But this isolation made them particularly vulnerable during severe storms. Without quick access to outside help, medieval leprosaria were typically simple buildings, often not much better than huts. During storms, their precarious roofs would often cave in, exposing already weakened patients to the elements. A record from 1291 describes how the leper's house outside the walls of Reims collapsed during the Great Storm, burying 6 of the afflicted who could not escape because of their weakness and deformities. No rescue was attempted for 3 days, as the inhabitants of the city were afraid to approach, even to help these unfortunates. The situation was all the more tragic because many lepers had already been rejected by their families and communities. When natural disasters destroyed their precarious shelters, they often had nowhere to go and no one to help them. A chronicler noted in 1288 that after the storm that destroyed the lazaret, the lepers wandered the roads like ghosts, rejected in every village, forced to sleep in open fields, even as more rain fell. Many died this way, not from the disease that was slowly consuming them, but from exposure to the elements that no body, healthy or sick, could withstand for long. The supply of medicines, already scarce under normal conditions, was often completely cut off after severe storms. One doctor lamented in 1292 that the ointments that brought some relief to the leper's sores ran out after the floods destroyed the herbs in our gardens. Their cries of pain could be heard beyond the city walls at night, a constant reminder of the suffering we could not alleviate. Ironically, storms occasionally benefited lepers in unexpected ways. In some communities, natural disasters were interpreted as divine signs that society had treated its most vulnerable members too cruelly. A record from 1294 mentions that after the 3rd storm in a month, the bishop declared that God was punishing the city for its harshness towards the afflicted. He ordered that better accommodation be built for the lepers, and that they be given larger portions of food and wine. Thus, out of their misfortune came some comfort, albeit temporary. Another particularly vulnerable place during storms were asylums for so-called lunatics or possessed, people we would recognize today as suffering from mental or neurological disorders. These early psychiatric hospitals, often run by religious orders, combined genuine care with superstition and practices we would consider cruel today. During storms, the behavior of patients with conditions such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder often intensified due to environmental stress. This was invariably interpreted in supernatural terms. A monk in charge of an asylum wrote in 1289 that when lightning lit up the sky and thunder shook the walls, the possessed roared like wolves, banged their heads against walls, or fell into violent convulsions. It was as if the demons within them responded to the demons in the sky, rejoicing in the storm that terrified the pious. Containment methods used in medieval asylums became particularly dangerous during natural disasters. Patients chained or confined in small cells could not escape when structures collapsed or waters rose. A disturbing account from 1290 describes how 7 of the lunatics, chained to the walls of their chamber, drowned when the river overflowed and flooded the lower floor of the asylum. Their screams were interpreted as the demons leaving their bodies, not as humans dying in agony. The belief that storms aggravated mental illness was so strong that some asylums developed specific protocols for periods of bad weather. A 1283 manual from a hospital in Flanders instructed that when storms threaten, the possessed should be more firmly restrained, their rooms sprinkled with holy water, and crosses placed above their beds. If possible, they should be sedated with potions of valerian and poppy so that they don't hurt themselves in their demon-inspired frenzies. For patients who physically survived the storms, the psychological trauma often aggravated their underlying conditions. One doctor observed in 1294 that those who were already disturbed before the great storm became completely incoherent afterwards, haunted by visions of the sky opening up and angels of death descending among lightning bolts. Many never recovered even the fragile equilibrium they had previously possessed. Hospital ships, a relatively rare but significant innovation at the end of the 13th century, deserve special mention. These ships, usually maintained by religious military orders, such as the Knights Hospitallers, sailed between Mediterranean ports, offering basic medical care. During storms, they were transformed into scenes of unspeakable horror. A survivor of a shipwreck in 1291 described how the hospital ship, carrying sick and wounded pilgrims from the Holy Land, was hit by a storm near Cyprus. The patients, already weak and many unable to move unaided, were tossed around like dolls as the ship was battered by the waves. When water began to enter the hold, where the most seriously injured were accommodated, the screams were blood-curdling. The few doctors and nurses on board faced the impossible dilemma of who to try to save first, knowing that many were beyond any human help. The presence of medicines and medical equipment on board these ships created additional dangers during storms. An account from 1288 mentions that when the ship began to sink, vials of alchemical preparations broke on the deck, mixing with the seawater to create toxic fumes that suffocated many before the waves could claim them. Thus, those seeking healing met with an even quicker death from the very remedies that were supposed to save them. Port cities faced another unique challenge during severe storms. Quarantined ships anchored in their harbors. These ships, kept at a distance from cities when suspected of carrying contagious diseases, were particularly vulnerable during storms. A record from 1293 describes how the Venetian ship suspected of carrying the plague was assigned to anchor far from the port of Marseille. When the storm hit, its moorings broke, and it was dragged into the main harbor, colliding with other ships before sinking. The fear of contagion was so great that rescuers refused to help the castaways, allowing them to drown just a few meters from the shore. In the following days, fishermen reported seeing bodies floating in the bay, but no one dared retrieve them, fearing that the water itself was contaminated. Medieval agriculture, already precarious in normal times, faced unique challenges during and after severe storms. Let's explore some specific aspects that are rarely discussed. Medieval apiaries, essential for both pollination and the production of honey, the main sweetener of the time, were particularly vulnerable. One beekeeper lamented in 1290 that the hives were blown over by the wind as if they were made of straw, not solid wood. The bees, confused by the rain and darkness in broad daylight, flew about disoriented until they fell exhausted on the muddy ground. Out of 20 hives, before the storm, only 3 survived with live queens. The loss of bees had far-reaching consequences that went far beyond the immediate shortage of honey. A perceptive observer noted in 1294 that the year after the great storm that killed most of the bees, the orchards produced only a tenth of their normal harvest because there were not enough pollinators for the flowers. Thus, the one-day storm caused famine for many years in ways that few understood. Fruit orchards, long-term investments that took years or even decades to reach full productivity, could be devastated in minutes by severe storms. One landowner wrote in 1288 that the pear trees that my grandfather planted, some of which were over 50 years old and so thick that 2 men couldn't hold them, were pulled out by the roots as if they were weeds. I lost the work of 3 generations in one night. Not even my grandchildren will see this property produce like it used to. Medieval viticulture, the economic mainstay of many regions, was particularly sensitive to storms. Unlike cereals, which could be replanted the following season, vineyards represented a decades-long investment. A Burgundian vintner lamented in 1289 that the hail cut through the buds and leaves like sharp knives, leaving only bare branches where before there had been promise of a bountiful harvest. But the worst was yet to come, as the wounded vines developed rot that spread like wildfire, killing plants that had produced wine for generations. It will take 3 years for new vineyards to start producing, and 20 for them to reach the quality of the ones we lost. Another aspect rarely considered is the impact of storms on salt production, an essential commodity for food preservation in the pre-refrigeration era. Coastal salt pans, where seawater was evaporated in large, shallow pans, could be completely destroyed by storms and high tides. A 1293 record from the French Atlantic coast describes how the salt pans that supported 30 families were swept away by the raging sea, transforming salt water into fresh water by the violence of its movement. The crystals already formed dissolved again, and the dikes that kept the sea in check were destroyed so completely that the land became uninhabitable, impregnated with salt, and useless for any other cultivation. The resulting salt shortage had devastating consequences for the food security of entire regions. A chronicler noted in 1294 that after the destruction of the salt pans, By the storm of St. Michael's Day, there was no way to preserve meat from the autumn slaughter families were forced to consume. In weeks, what would normally last until spring. The result was short feasts, followed by months of debilitating hunger. Many died not from the immediate violence of the storm, but from the slow starvation that followed due to the impossibility of preserving food. Fishing, another crucial source of protein, was similarly affected. Coastal fishing villages not only lost boats and equipment during storms, but also faced long periods when the sea remained too dangerous for navigation, or when shoals were dispersed by changes in currents and water temperatures. A 1287 record of an English fishing village reports that after the storm that destroyed half our boats and nets, the sea remained rough for 3 weeks, preventing even the surviving boats from leaving. When they were finally able to sail again, they discovered that the herring beds had completely disappeared, moving into uncharted waters. Families who had lived off the sea for generations were reduced to begging or abandoning the village in search of work in the cities. Water mills, essential for processing grain into flour, faced a cruel paradox during storms. The same water that provided the energy for their operation often destroyed them when in excess. A record from 1292 describes how the mill that served 3 villages was carried away by the flood like a child's toy. The water wheel, so heavy that 10 men could barely move it for repairs, was found miles downstream, wedged between trees like a monstrous disc. With no means of grinding grain, people ate wheat soaked in water or boiled whole, causing severe stomach pains and little sustenance. Even apparently simple pastures could be ruined for long periods after severe storms. A shepherd observed in 1290 that the fields where sheep had been grazing for generations were covered with mud brought by the river. When the waters receded, they left a crust as hard as stone that no grass could penetrate. The flock, with nothing to eat, was wasting away before our eyes. Even more terrible were the strange and poisonous plants that began to grow where before there had only been healthy grass, killing lambs that ate them out of desperation. The impact on medieval forests, a crucial source of fuel, building materials, and supplementary food, game, nuts, berries, was equally devastating and far-reaching. A forest record from 1289 laments that the wind felled in one night more oaks than 10 years of felling by the villagers. Century-old trees, each worth more than a peasant's house, lay like broken toothpicks. The wood would rot before it could be fully utilized. Such was the amount felled. The recovery of the forests was particularly slow, with consequences that lasted for generations. An insightful forest manager observed in 1295 that 6 years after the Great Storm, the clearings opened by the fury of the wind were taken over not by new young trees, but by impenetrable thorn bushes where wolves and bandits found refuge. What was once productive forest became dangerous wilderness, useless to the community. Our grandchildren may see oaks growing again where there are now only thorns, but we won't live to see it. Medieval irrigation systems, crucial in more arid regions such as parts of Spain, Italy, and the Levant, were particularly vulnerable to damage from flash floods. A 1288 record from Valencia describes how the canals built by the Moors 300 years ago which turned desert into garden, were destroyed in a night of furious rain. Stones that 100 men couldn't move were swept away by the water like pebbles, blocking passageways and smashing floodgates. Lands that the week before were green with vegetation began to dry up under the sun, the precious water now flowing unchecked into the sea instead of nourishing crops. Rebuilding these complex systems was often beyond the technical capacity and resources of the affected communities, especially when specialized knowledge had been lost. A common lament in post-storm records was that our fathers knew how to build these works, but that knowledge died with them. We try to repair the damage with our limited skills, but the water finds new paths around our imperfect repairs, mocking our efforts. Let's explore the impact of medieval storms on specific groups in society in more detail, starting with urban craftsmen. Artisans' workshops, often located in basements or first floors of urban buildings, were particularly vulnerable to flooding. A 1291 record from Florence describes how the workshop of the master dyer, with its huge pots and expensive dyes, was completely flooded when the Arno overflowed. The dyes mixed with the dirty water, staining everything with grotesque colors: walls, tools, the floor itself. Fabrics worth a year's work, prepared for the merchants of Lombardy, were ruined in one night. For craftsmen who worked with materials that were particularly sensitive to humidity, such as musical instrument makers, paper makers, or manuscript illuminators, even relatively mild storms could be catastrophic. A luthier from Paris lamented in 1289 that humidity has penetrated my workshop like an evil spirit, invisible but destructive. Vials and lutes that had dried out for years cracked as if struck by axes. Taut strings snapped with rumbles that sounded like small thunderclaps. The work of a decade was lost, and the wood for new instruments will need years to dry properly. Medieval apothecaries and alchemists faced unique dangers during storms. Their workshops, filled with volatile and often flammable substances, could become death traps when damaged by water or lightning. A record from 1293 describes how Master Giraldo's apothecary was struck by lightning, which set fire to the stored essences and oils. The flames were strange colors: green, blue, and purple, and the smoke they gave off caused terrifying visions in those who inhaled it. 3 apprentices died not from the fire, but from suffocation from the poisonous fumes released when jars of mercury and arsenic broke in the heat. Medieval financial markets, although rudimentary by modern standards, were also severely impacted by severe storms. A Florentine banker noted in 1290 that after the great flood that destroyed bridges and isolated cities for weeks, many merchants were unable to honor bills of exchange within the specified time. Credit that had been built up over generations was destroyed as quickly as the bridges. Bank houses that seemed solid as rocks collapsed when their debtors, physically unable to travel due to the destroyed roads, were unable to pay their debts. The interruption of commercial communications after severe storms created opportunities for elaborate frauds. A court record from 1294 describes how certain unscrupulous men, knowing that roads were blocked by the storm, sent false messengers to creditors claiming that their debtors had died in the catastrophe. Based on this false information, properties were redistributed and new contracts signed, causing legal confusion that persisted for years, even after the fraud was discovered. Foreigners and travelers trapped in unfamiliar places during storms were particularly vulnerable, not only to the elements, but to xenophobia exacerbated by crises. A Venetian merchant wrote in 1288 about his experience in a French town during catastrophic floods. When food and clean water began to run short, whispers against foreign mouths became open threats. I was forced to hide my accent and pretend to be from a nearby province, fearing that my Italian origin would make me an easy target for desperate crowds looking for scapegoats. Medieval universities, centers of knowledge that attracted students from all over Europe, often became microcosms of the wider tensions during natural disasters. A 1292 record from the University of Paris describes how, after the storm that destroyed part of the banks of the Seine, students from different nations formed rival gangs fighting for control of the remaining shelters. English against French, Germans against Italians. Academic solidarity completely disintegrated in the face of the basic need for a dry roof. Medieval hospitals, already overloaded in normal times, faced almost insurmountable challenges during and after severe storms. A doctor from Montpellier wrote in 1290 that, for every patient we could accommodate in beds, 10 lay on the floor. For every wound we could treat properly, 20 feasted without care. The water we used to wash wounds was itself contaminated, often causing more harm than good. The cries of the sufferers were so constant that doctors and nurses couldn't sleep for days, making fatal mistakes due to exhaustion. The lack of antibiotics made even relatively minor injuries potentially fatal when contracted during storms. A surgeon observed in 1293 that wounds that in normal times would heal without complications became putrid within days when contaminated by dirty floodwater. Gangrene spread with frightening speed, forcing amputations that few victims survived. The smell of rotting flesh was so intense in the hospital that even experienced doctors vomited while working. Medieval midwives, crucial figures in communities where childbirth was exclusively home-based, often faced perilous journeys during storms to attend to women in labor. A moving record from 1291 describes how the midwife Agnes called to assist a primiparous mother during the worst storm in memory was swept away by floodwaters while trying to cross the stream that separated her house from the patient. Her body was found 2 days later, still clutching tightly to the bag containing her instruments. The mother and child she had hoped to help also perished, assisted only by inexperienced neighbors. The administration of justice often collapsed completely after severe storms. A court record from 1289 notes that prisoners escaped when prison walls collapsed during the storm. Legal records, including evidence of pending trials, were destroyed by water or subsequent fire. Witnesses died or were unable to travel to court due to destroyed roads. Crimes committed during the chaos rarely resulted in convictions, as the very structure of the law had been temporarily dissolved by the fury of the elements. Medieval schools, usually operating in ecclesiastical or municipal buildings of varying quality often suffered prolonged interruptions after severe storms. A schoolmaster lamented in 1294 that the roof of the school, already precarious before, was completely torn off by the storm. Classes continued precariously under stretched tarpaulins. But when it rained, the water penetrated and ruined precious books. Students constantly fell ill with colds and fevers. Learning virtually ceased for an entire season, a setback from which many young people never fully recovered. The jugglers, traveling musicians, storytellers, and other itinerant performers who enlivened medieval fairs and festivals faced unique challenges during storms. A chronicler noted in 1290 that those who made their living entertaining the public were reduced to begging when the annual fair was canceled due to floods. Their instruments, often their only valuables, were damaged by the damp or completely lost in the flight of the rising waters. Some tried to entertain anyway, playing in taverns crowded with refugees, exchanging music for a dry corner to sleep in or a hot meal. The loss of musical instruments was particularly devastating for professional musicians, representing not only a material loss, but the very ability to make a living. A record from 1293 mentions a minstrel who wept more bitterly for the loss of his harp, drowned in the flood, than for the death of his horse. The animal, he said, could be replaced eventually, but the harp had been tuned for 20 years until it reached a voice that no new instrument could match. Medieval breweries and wineries, crucial both economically and socially, faced specific risks during storms. A York brewer lamented in 1288 that the floodwater contaminated our barrels of already fermented beer and ruined the malt stored for future production. Worse, yeasts carefully cultivated for generations were lost when the containers holding them were knocked over. The beer produced in the following months was of such inferior quality that even thirsty peasants refused it, preferring water from freshly cleaned wells. The community ovens, where most of the inhabitants baked their bread, since few could afford private ovens, were often damaged or completely destroyed during storms. A record from 1290 describes how the oven serving 40 families collapsed when the clay base softened in the constant rain. With no means of baking bread, people ate raw dough or tried to cook it in small stoves, resulting in undercooked food that caused severe stomach pains. When a new oven was finally built 2 weeks later, the stored flour had gone completely moldy, prolonging the famine even after the structure was restored. Foundry and forge workshops, by necessity operating with constant fire, faced extraordinary dangers during lightning storms. A record from 1287 describes how the blacksmith's forge, the highest point in the village beyond the church, attracted a bolt of lightning of terrible force that not only set fire to the roof, but melted metal tools as if they were wax. The blacksmith and 2 apprentices were killed instantly, their bodies burned beyond recognition. With them died the knowledge of how to temper steel. For the best blades, a secret passed down from master to apprentice that had not been fully passed on. Medieval barber surgeons who combined haircuts with basic medical procedures such as bloodletting, tooth extraction, and wound treatment saw their workload multiply exponentially After storms, a record from 1294 notes that Master Guillaume did not sleep for 3 days after the great storm, running from house to house to treat the wounded. His lancets were blind from so much use, and his bleeding bottles were overflowing. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, his apprentices continued the work, albeit with less skill, causing scars that would mark survivors for the rest of their lives. Or medieval laundries, usually located on the banks of rivers for easy access to water, were particularly vulnerable to flash floods. A record from 1291 mentions that the laundresses working on the river were surprised by the sudden rise of the Aba'a waters. 3 were swept away by the current, along with the clothes they were washing. Fine sheets destined for the castle and cloaks that represented the bulk of peasant families' possessions. In the days that followed, pieces of fabric could be seen hanging from trees miles downstream, like macabre flags marking the path of destruction. Monastic singing schools, responsible for training boys for choirs that performed elaborate liturgical services, faced interruptions that went beyond a mere pause in learning. A choir master lamented in 1289 that when the choristers' dormitory collapsed during the storm, we not only lost 2 talented boys who were crushed in their beds, but also the continuity of the musical tradition. Voices that had been trained for years for specific performances were permanently silenced. Certain works composed specifically for their particular vocal abilities would never again be heard as intended by the composer. Medieval manuscripts, each representing months or years of painstaking work, were particularly vulnerable to water damage. A scribe of a monastic scriptorium wrote in 1292 that the water that penetrated through the damaged roof fell directly on the evangeliary, on which Brother Thomas had worked for 7 years. The inks dissolved before our eyes, turning finely detailed saints into shapeless colored spots. The gold applied to the illuminations, the work of months, peeled off the pages like the scales of a dead fish. The parchment, prepared with such care, wrinkled and deformed beyond any possibility of restoration. Academic activities suffered interruptions that went far beyond the mere temporary suspension of classes. An Oxford scholar lamented in 1290 that the storm that flooded my chamber destroyed notes and manuscripts representing 10 years of study on Aristotle. What memory retains is only a fraction of what was meticulously recorded on now illegible pages. Knowledge that could have benefited future generations has returned to nothingness as if it had never been conceived. Marriage fairs, important social events where young people from different villages could get to know each other under communal supervision, were often ruined by sudden storms. A chronicler noted in 1293 that the annual marriage fair, for which girls had prepared dresses and dowries for months, was completely destroyed by the storm that arrived without warning. Not only were tents and decorations ruined, but carefully accumulated dowries, bedding, household utensils, small jewels, were damaged or completely lost in the waters. Many young women saw their chances of marriage postponed for a whole year or more, precious time at a time when women's reproductive lives were dangerously short. Medieval notaries and registries responsible for documenting land transactions, marriages, wills, and other crucial legal documents, suffered catastrophic damage during floods. A notary from Genoa wrote in 1288 that the water that invaded my office destroyed property records dating back a century, land titles, marriage contracts, wills, all reduced to unreadable pulp. Disputes over who owned what land or what the exact terms of an agreement were would persist for generations, causing family divisions more lasting than the storm itself. Medieval couriers, already slow and irregular in ideal conditions, often came to a complete halt after severe storms. A royal administrator noted in 1294 that messages that would normally take a week to be delivered did not arrive even after a month. Crucial decisions were made on the basis of outdated information. Orders were sent to officials who had already died in the storm, and resources were directed to areas that were no longer in the greatest need. The kingdom functioned like a body whose limbs no longer responded to the commands of the head. The impact on domestic animals is rarely discussed in historical accounts, but it was deeply felt in communities where these animals represented not only working tools, but often beloved companions. A shepherd wrote in 1291 about his working dog, Bracco, who had faithfully guarded sheep for 7 years without ever losing a lamb to wolves, was swept away by the waters while trying to lead the flock to higher ground. His last act was to bark warnings that allowed me to save most of the sheep. Without him, the flock is at the mercy of predators, and I have lost not only a valuable tool, but a companion more loyal than many men. Relations between feudal lords and serfs often deteriorated after natural disasters. A chronicler noted in 1290 that after the storm that destroyed both the manorial mill and the serfs' huts, the baron demanded that the peasants rebuild the mill first, postponing repairs to their own homes. When they protested that children were falling ill due to exposure, they were publicly flogged as an example. The resentment that sprang from this treatment would persist for generations, manifesting itself in subtle sabotage and deliberately shoddy work. In contrast, some lords recognized that their own well-being depended on the recovery of their serfs. A record from 1292 praises an earl who opened his granaries to feed peasants who had lost everything in the flood, suspended tax collection for a year, and provided wood from his own forests to rebuild houses. If my servants die, who will cultivate my lands? He asked when questioned about his generosity. It's not charity, but necessity. The long-term psychological impact on children who survived severe storms is an aspect often neglected in historical analyses. A professor observed in 1294 that children who experienced the Great Flood 3 years ago still tremble uncontrollably at the first sign of rain. Many refuse to sleep alone, tormented by nightmares of drowning. Their games often reenact the catastrophe, with dolls representing floating bodies and collapsing houses. The storm only lasted a day, but for these children, it never really ended. The communities that survived catastrophic storms best were often those with strong oral traditions that preserved memories of previous disasters and survival strategies. A scholar researching folklore noted in 1295 that villages where elders regularly shared stories of past floods marking water levels on memorial stones and teaching escape routes to youngsters, suffered significantly fewer deaths during the recent catastrophe. Seemingly simple songs contained coded instructions on which hills to look for, which natural signs indicated impending storms, and how to build temporary shelters. These oral traditions often incorporated practical knowledge into easily memorized formats. One example, recorded in 1288, was a nursery rhyme that translated, "When ants climb walls in straight rows, tether your cattle, and protect your crops." Modern observations confirm that certain species of ants do indeed alter their behavior in response to barometric changes that precede storms. Empirical knowledge preserved in seemingly trivial popular culture. Some places developed primitive but effective warning systems. A record from 1293 describes how villages along the Loire River kept watch at high points during rainy seasons. At the first sign of abnormally rising waters, they rang bells in specific patterns that conveyed not only imminent danger, but rough estimates of how much time remained before the waters arrived. This simple system, maintained for generations, saved countless lives during this year's great flood. Let's be honest, you, used to your air conditioning, your full fridge, your Netflix, and your Uber Eats, wouldn't last a day in the Middle Ages, and a thunderstorm would be the least of your problems. But maybe that's why we still talk so much about those times, to remember how far we've come, how much we've achieved in terms of safety and comfort. The next time you're comfortably watching a storm from your window, with a hot cup of tea in your hands, and the certainty that your roof won't collapse, remember your ancestors from 1297. For them, every clap of thunder could be the last sound they hear. Every flash of lightning could be the last light they see. Every drop of rain could be part of the flood that would sweep away everything they knew. Oh, and there's one more thing, perhaps the most important. When you hear the sound of the rain hitting your roof tonight, as you snuggle under your dry covers, remember that you have something that your medieval ancestors never had during a storm: the certainty that it will pass, and that you will most likely be safe when the sun shines. Again, this certainty, this luxury of not fearing your own end with every thunderclap, is a recent privilege in human history, a privilege built on centuries of learning, often painfully, how to build safer structures, how to predict storms, how to manage water, how to organize efficient aid. Our ability to weather storms today is not just a technological triumph, but a social and cultural one, the result of countless lives that have faced the terror we describe here, and that have slowly, generation after generation, built not just tougher buildings, but more resilient societies. So the next time a storm keeps you awake at night, maybe you can use that time for a moment of gratitude. Gratitude for all those who came before us, who faced the worst that nature could offer with nothing but faith and hope, who learned hard lessons so that we could sleep soundly, who looked at the same stormy sky you see today, but with very different eyes. Eyes filled not only with fear, but with a courage we can barely imagine. I hope you enjoyed this not-so-comfortable trip back in time. If you'd like more stories that will make you thankful you live in the 21st century, let us know in the comments what aspects of medieval life you'd like to see in the next ones. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share with friends who also like bedtime stories or nightmares. Good night, and may tonight's thunder be just a relaxing sound in the background while you sleep in your safe, dry home.